Hello all. So this is a quick overview of the final paper. So essentially this paper is just a combination of the three essays we did this semester. So this one isn't so much more work as the rest. It's just going to be kind of concluding everything and showing that you know how to make the connections between your topic, your literature review, and the variables that you've chosen to analyze. So for this paper, you're going to conclude by imagining that you had conducted the study itself. So when you've gone through and said that you chose a topic, looked into its background, and then in essay 3 talked about what variables you chose, you're going to imagine that you actually ran those variables together and got some results. So for instance, with the example paper we've been looking at, for this sample paper here, I'm going to pull this one out down here. So this student had gone through, we've been looking at this throughout the semester about marriage. They had their research interest here, talking about the backgrounds of it, the higher levels of divorce rates. Their hypothesis was that the higher education or higher income has an effect on the happiness in a person's marriage. So they test this hypothesis with income and education. So when you're talking about this, you would imagine then that you're testing your hypothesis as well with whatever two variables you came up, whether it's income and education like this student did, or something along the lines of perhaps class, race, sex or gender, these sorts of things. And then in the third section, we had the methods, where this student talked about how they were run these two variables together, in this case happiness and marriage, they mentioned here, as we looked at in short essay 3, as well as income and education levels. And they said they were going to run a chi-square test. So in this course, they ran the numbers and they actually talked about it. In our course, we're going to be more interested in imagining one way or the other. So go back and imagine then that either A, when you ran these numbers and you had the statistical tools to do this, that your conclusion said, yes, this hypothesis is true, that for instance we'll go back to the example, that income did have something to do with happiness in marriage. So for instance, the more income somebody had, the more happy they were in marriage, then you would write this conclusion as though that happened. So in this instance, or you could go the other way and say something like that it turns out that income doesn't have anything to do with happiness in marriage. So for instance, it doesn't make a difference whether someone's rich or someone is poor, that you can't really tell whether or not it's going to be happy in marriage. So in this instance, you go through and you would talk about how, then you would go through and write the conclusion one way or the other. So this student, for instance, imagine that they did not see a relationship between income and happiness in marriage. The reason we're surprised because people mention divorce is usually tied with finances. So this is something I found in their literature review. We're not too surprised that education did not play a factor in happiness in marriage because we feel men or women are educated or more analytical. So they talk about why they think that could be. So one of the things you want to look at as far as we're talking about this is just kind of play through these questions to see either imagining that they did have a relationship and what that would look like. So say in this instance, this student wanted to talk about how there was a relationship. They might actually say that education did play a factor in happiness in marriage. So you might say something like, the more educated someone is, the more likely it is for them to maybe be more financially secure. So they have less money problems, therefore less divorce, something like that. So some of the questions you're going to be looking at this. Some questions for this section is, how can I make conclusions about my hypothesis? How does my research connect with the articles that I read or what other people are thinking about? Were these results surprising? Is there problems with the data? So if you look through some of the data sets, you might see something like only 20 people were asked a question. What could future research look like? So for instance, if the only variables you could find weren't as good as what you're interested in, you might say that maybe in future surveys they could ask those questions. On what changes, in general, then bigger question things would be something, what changes could be made in society to make society better? So if you were looking at things like homelessness and you notice that one of the biggest reasons people are homeless is because of high levels of unemployment, one of the changes that could be made in society to make it better would be something along the lines of maybe having education more accessible to people in society. So as you're doing this, you're basically going to be combining your essays. So I have this here as a minimum of 1,200 words, but basically what you're going to be doing is I imagine this being turned in, and you would turn in each of your essays you've written so far and make any adjustments that you had to make. So for instance, if you had the research topic and maybe you didn't have, you had some errors in that, you didn't get full points for it. So this would be your opportunity to make those adjustments and put it in here. And then you would go in and add essay number 2, your discussion on the background topic. So you could paste that one in there, and feel free to copy and paste it directly from what you turned in before. And just make any adjustments. For instance, in this one, if you didn't come up with enough citations, you only had 2 citations, go ahead and add that third one so you can get the points in this case. The third one is like from essay 3, whatever you discussed before about your topic with your literature and the variables. So the requirements for essay 3, if you didn't meet those requirements, this would be your chance to make that better, so you could attach it here. And this would be the new part. The final part here is basically a concluding section which connects the imagined outcomes. So basically going back through and discussing then whether your hypothesis were proven or disproven, and appropriate discussion of the results. How did you or did you not connect with your variables and the literature? So you'd go through and answer questions like these and connect it with the different things you talked about. So it's also at this point, feel free to ask me any questions you have specifically about this, but it also is quite useful to go through and look at this samples essay, because there's someone who did really well with this. So as long as you kind of follow this general outline here and get some of these main points across, this would be something you get full points for as far as we're concerned with this final paper. And again, the grading section is down at the bottom. The points basically are if you're fulfilling each of the requirements. So basically going back through, if you made the 1,200 words, which again is basically just the same amount of words you would have if you combined your 3 essays. You have your 3 citations minimum. Discussion of the research topics, that's from essay 1, so make sure you get that information in there. Discussion of the background, that's like essay number 2. So make sure you have your full literature in there as well as your citations page clearly formatted if you lost points in that before. And finally, the third essay requirements, talking about your variables and how they connect to your methods. And then this concluding section is to be the bulk of the new points for this paper, looking to see how well you concluded and how well you were thoughtfully engaging with the rest of these topics. So basically getting from beginning to end, this will be the outline of what a good research paper would look like in general.